Hello and welcome. This is Pastor Ken Ortize, and we are now in a several months study of the book of 2 Timothy. We've been going through verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and now we're in chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 4, really, where Paul is putting the closing comments, or maybe closing exhortation to Timothy about how Timothy should respond to the change in circumstances that were taking place all over the Roman world as a result of Nero's persecution of the church. I don't want to go back into the history of that too much, but many of you know that the city of Rome had caught on fire. Something like 13 or 14 of the districts out of 16 districts of the city had been damaged by the fire, many of them completely obliterated. It's really mindful of what happened in Maui recently, and there was little left, and there were nearly a million people who were homeless. That's the irony of it. Rome at that time was the only city in the world that had a population of 1 million and would be the only city to have that size of a population until 1840 when London reached that million mark. But one of the reasons the fire was so terrible was because the city was built largely of wood. If you go to Rome today, you see a lot of the majestic buildings built in stone, and that was really in the aftermath of the destruction that came with the fire of Rome. They began to build sturdier, more fire-resistant buildings. In fact, the city of Spokane went through the same thing in the beginning of the 20th century, and all of our down buildings are made of brick and stone for that very same reason. Well, it certainly changed the structure of the city, but the problem for Nero was that he was being held accountable for what had taken place. And so he needed a scapegoat, and that scapegoat became the Christians. And this had a lot of implications for the church, because up to this time, Christians had been viewed as part of the Jewish community, even though there were probably more Gentiles than Jews in the church at that time. But there was still this commingling, especially if we look at Paul's letter to the Romans. We know that there was a lot of Jews and Gentiles that were gathering in fellowship within the churches in Rome. But with the edict of Nero against the Christians, there came a separation, that Christians were no longer what was called a legal religion. They were an illegal religion. And as a consequence, the government had free hand to do with them as they pleased. Nero chose them. And of course, Paul wrote this letter after having been apprehended, put in prison to Rome. I believe he was captured elsewhere, but he was taken to Rome, put in prison, and then was held before a tribunal, which ultimately ended in him being executed. And because he was a Roman citizen, his execution involved decapitation with a sword. So Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified. That was considered to be too lowly a death for a Roman citizen. That was, in fact, the most humiliating and painfully long kind of execution you could go through, because many people who hung on crosses would hang there for days, even sometimes a few weeks, before they finally expired. But the other thing was they were hung there completely naked, and so they became the object of a lot of jeering. Birds of the air would come and peck at them. If you ever seen The Passion of the Christ, it's a pretty fair depiction of what one would have suffered while hanging on the cross. But in most cases, their deaths were not quick. They came after a long period of time. And so Romans considered that to be too vile a punishment for a Roman citizen, and so therefore they simply took those who were guilty of what they called insurrection. That means rebelling against Rome, which could include not paying your taxes, and they would just simply sever their head and then confiscate all of their properties. Well, Paul is awaiting, knowing that this is ultimately going to be his fate, even though his final ruling had not come, but he knew that everything was already in. The fix was already in, and so he is instructing Timothy. And what we find in this letter as he comes to the end of it, he's really kind of pointing very clearly at the ground that Timothy needed to hold, the places where he needed to stand if he was going to stand firm and overcome the spiritual warfare that was going to follow. Because the persecution didn't stop, certainly, with Paul. It extended to many leaders. Nero kind of gave up on the persecution when he figured he had really kind of deferred the blame someplace else. And not too long afterwards, afterwards, the Lord's punishment came and he himself was assassinated. But it was the beginning of a series of official persecutions. We estimate somewhere around 10 over the next 200 years. They would come out every 25 years. The church would be faced with tremendous persecution. And in light of that kind of coming adversity, Paul is really trying to give Timothy all of the tools he can possibly give to him to be able to hold on to his faith. And in this last chapter, there are really kind of three things that he mentions here, and they're all built around the idea of being prepared. We'll talk about in a moment where he says, be prepared in season and out of season. But these are the things that you need to do. The first one, he says, is preach the word. If we don't have the courage to preach the word, we won't have the courage to stand in faith. I love what C.S. Lewis once said, that we often talk about courage as if it's one of the virtues. He said, in fact, courage is the key virtue, that courage is what's required to have faith, courage is what's required to have love, courage is what's required to have forgiveness. So a lot of people turn these faith, hope, and love and things like this, they toss these terms around, but they don't really seem to understand that you just don't have faith without having the courage to follow faith. And that's the biggest thing. That's why when you look at, for example, the conquest of Canaan, the first chapter of Joshua is this repeated exhortation, number one, not to be afraid, but secondly, to be bold and courageous. And I think if there's anything that we as Christians need to focus on is our own lack of courage. Now, what creates a lack of courage? Well, mostly it's a fear of death. It can be a fear of death of a relationship, the fear of death of a business, a fear of death of your health or whatever. But mostly it's a fear of death itself, the idea that I will come to my demise. And Paul says that we have to be people who are courageous enough to preach the word. That secondly, he said, we need to have the courage to be watchful. In other words, the watchfulness is there isn't kind of this paranoid looking over our shoulder all the time. Though the watchfulness is this idea that I'm looking and waiting, as Paul would later say, to be one of those who loves the appearing of the Lord. So if you go to the airport to pick up a loved one that you hadn't seen in a while, you wait there with excitement. You may be in the cell phone waiting area, but you're waiting to get that call so that you can drive up and pick your loved one. Or if you're really anxious, you park your car, pay the fee, and you sit and wait at baggage claim to meet them. But the whole concept is you're looking forward, anticipating the reunion that's going to take place. And so when Paul talks about being watchful, he says, we need to be people who are looking for and hastening towards the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Not that we do anything to make it come faster, but we recognize that the whole purpose, the whole central purpose of preaching the word is to fulfill the responsibility that God has given us as followers of Christ until he comes. And then in verse 9 is the last word of exhortation. We need to preach the word in verse 2. We need to be watchful in verse 5. In verse 9, he says, be diligent. Be diligent. And diligent is one of those really interesting words. It's almost paired with the word vigilant. To be diligent and be vigilant means that you're busy occupying your time doing the things that need to be taken care of, and you're paying great attention to it. See, watchful is vigilance. Diligence means that I am following the duties and responsibilities faithfully on a day-by-day basis. And diligence is one of the things that I find is often missing. I find that many people start well, they fade somewhere in the middle, and then they drop off the screen completely. And we can say on one hand that maybe you didn't count the cost adequately, but many times they just give up before they really begin to reap the rewards. I'm thankful to my mother because one of the things that she wouldn't let me do when I was a kid was quit. I mean, I enrolled in all sorts of things that I thought were going to be fun, and when I found there was a degree of work involved in them, I was always wanting to quit, and my mom said, you quit when it's over, but you never quit. Once you commit, you see it through to the end. That had two effects on me. One is I began to really count the costs of what this commitment was going to involve, and secondly, when I committed myself to it, I realized that there was going to be this long dry period in the middle with a lot of hard work, but at the end, there was going to be the reward. And this is the kind of sense that Paul is trying to create in Timothy, that you need to preach the word, you need to do it daily, you need to do it in the sense that can't do it forever because you're waiting for his return, and you want to make sure that it becomes the primary thing that you're committed to, knowing that at the end of your labors is going to come the great reward. We'll continue this on tomorrow as we pick it up again in the second part of verse 2, where he says, be prepared, and we'll talk about the context of that statement. God bless and go in his grace.